My name is David Phillips, and I'm the director of the program on Peacebuilding and Human Rights at Columbia University. We're very pleased that you are joining us for this Zoom conference on the targeting of religious minorities and Christians in Syria. We know from widespread reporting that there have been violations of international humanitarian law and a series of incidents that have targeted Syriacs, Christians. We know well about the genocide of the Yazidis. Today, what we want to do is to establish some additional facts. And the panelists who will present are extremely knowledgeable and will share with you information about conditions in northern Syria. When we think about genocide, we need to consider the definition of genocide in international law. There are different criteria. One or more persons were killed. They represent a particular ethnic, religious, or racial group. The perpetrator of those crimes knew that people would die when they committed those acts. Signatories to the Genocide Convention are obligated to prevent and punish genocide. So during the course of our conversation today, we're going to learn from the panelists what's happened, what facts can be established, and then we'll hear from Nadine about command responsibility and what can be done in the area of accountability. So we have a lot of ground to cover. We're going to try to do that in a 60-minute period. This event is being recorded and can be made available to the panelists and to others. If you have questions, use the chat function. We're very pleased at Columbia University to partner today's event with Justice for Kurds. My good friend Tom Kaplan and his colleague Emily Hamilton are with us. Tom is going to kick off the discussion, introduce the panelists, and then when we get to the dialogue, I'll facilitate the discussion. So, Tom, the floor is yours. We so admire the work of Justice for Kurds and what you have done to create the organization and to highlight abuses that have been committed not only against Kurds, but against Christians in Iraq and Syria. So let's now start the discussion. Tom, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you very much, David. Before I do, I'd like to point out that your work and that of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia, particularly the program on peacebuilding and rights, which you head, is at the vanguard of maintaining focus on the plight of the Kurds in Syria, as well as all of the minorities who've been subjected to genocide and persecution by various parties, including, of course, the Turks. Your work is extraordinary, and I doubt that there's any greater friend to Syria and all of its groups than you are. So first of all, thank you for giving us the privilege of being able to co-host with you. I think you've introduced Justice for Kurds. We were created by my partner, Bernard-Henri Lévy, and myself and Emily Hamilton in order to maintain the profile and the sense of gratitude that we in the West should have for the Kurds, and to ensure not only that they have advocates, and when one looks at our advisory board, you'll see it's perhaps amongst the most nonpartisan and ecumenical association of supporters as you could possibly imagine across all realms of the political spectrum in the United States, France, the UK, and elsewhere. Our mission is to make sure that the Kurds are not only not forgotten and that we can highlight their importance and their culture, but also that of all of the minorities with whom they find themselves in a similar position, and to make sure that the Kurds, as well as the Yazidis, the Armenians, Christian minorities, Jews, are part of what we hope to be a new and better Middle East. So with that, let me introduce the panelists. Archbishop Vicken Aykazian is from the Diocese of the Armenian Church of America. Abid Shamdeen is the co-founder of Nadia's initiative and an advocate for victims of the Yazidi genocide. Kino Gabriel is the spokesman of the Syrian Democratic Council, and Nadine Maenza is the commissioner, the U.S. Commission on the International Religious Freedom. And so with that, let me please pass the baton to Archbishop Aykazian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Good morning to everybody. I want to express my thanks and gratitude for this gathering today. And especially my thanks go to David Phillips, who extended the invitation to me to be a part of this gathering. I speak to you in my capacity as a long-time actor in the World Ecumenical and Interfaith Movement, who had had the honor of serving as a past president of National Council of Churches, presently member of board of National Council of Churches and World Council of Churches, as well as president of Christian Churches Together. I'm also here as a lifelong servant of the Armenian Orthodox Church, whose ministry led me to the Middle East, Europe, homeland of Armenia, and the United States, where I currently serve as ecumenical director of one of the largest Armenian church dioceses in the world. In these capacities, I'm well aware that the issue of religious freedom and its dark opposite, religious persecution, occupies a prominent place in our public discussion. In recent years, this issue has taken on a new urgency, compelled by concern from an unexpected quarter. Christian communities in hot spots across the world find themselves in serious danger, sometimes under attack, as their surrounding societies undergo rapid, often painful transformation. Middle East, of course, has been a region of deep concern. The region where Christianity was born and first flourished, which has been a home to Christian communities continuously and peaceably for centuries, has become, in the 21st century, in danger of seeing the extinction of those same Christian enclaves. Over the period, the historic Christian minorities communities in Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria have declined dramatically in population. What is even more alarming, the brave Christians who have chosen to remain in their historic homeland find their institutions, their homes, and their families under deliberate threat and fearful for their very lives. The bitter irony is that Christians have carefully avoided being party to such strife over the course of many generations, carefully charting a neutral path in the politics of the region, contributing to their respective societies without demanding much in return, except for the chance to live peaceably and to practice their way of life and worship. Our problem, of course, is that the voice of mutual toleration and respect are not always the most prominent or forceful ones in a given society. The problem is especially acute in the Middle East, where the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were all born and where all still live side by side. Yet, despite the delicate relation between them, all three faiths have historically been able to find a modus vivendi, a way of living that respects each other's historic presence in the region. Indeed, All three faiths can be said to be indigenous to the Middle East, and their respective faithful are therefore not newcomers to the region. Jews, Christians, and Muslims each have long histories and deep roots there. I note by way of example that the Armenian presence in Middle East dates back to early generation of Christian era, and that my people have enjoyed a long, productive history there. I further note that as recently as a century ago, the Middle East was seen as a refuge for Armenians fleeing the Armenian genocide. Syria is particularly became a heaven for Armenians fleeing death a century ago during the genocide period. Syrian cities and towns like Aleppo, Kesab, and others thrived historically as Armenian centers. Armenians built churches and monuments, worshiped freely, and were honored for their distribution to the broader society. I mentioned the word Kesab, which is a village, as you may know. I'm not going to concentrate it, but it was attacked by Turkish-backed Islamic fighters, and the church was almost demolished, the houses were burned, and majority of people escaped from Kesab. Recent decades have seen a dramatic change in these stages. Christians in general became targets of oppression, and large numbers were forced to flee their homes or were targeted for extinction. Not only the Christians, but the Kurds and the Yazidis have had the same problem as the Christians in that region. Today, the exodus of Christians and minorities from the Middle East and the severe decline of their communities is a topic of wide concern. A decade ago, it was the subject of a special synod held at the Vatican, and the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill has been a leader in ongoing discussions. Of course, there are many other organizations like World Council of Churches, National Council of Churches also. They have been involved for decades in the region. Again, I can refer to my own people as an example. For Armenians have certainly seen a depletion of their population throughout Middle Eastern communities. The Armenian community in Jerusalem, where I was educated and spent my favorite years, is today a painful fraction of what it was even 30 years ago. Of course, the problem of Jerusalem has nothing to do with the rest of the Middle East. The Armenian communities in Iraq were 35,000 people, now less than 5,000. The situation in northern Syria has been a great concern for the Armenians, especially the situation in Idlib, where majority of people there were Armenians and Orthodox, as well as Kurds and some Yazidis. The civil war caused suffering to many people there and still continuing. The city has been occupied by different terrorist groups. Nobody knows who is in charge. Nobody knows who is running, but everybody knows that the minorities are the ones that are suffering, and that suffering is going on. And of course, it could be solved. All this problem could be avoided if Turkey stopped involving or supporting the terrorist group or Islamic groups. We all know, and mainly the sources comes from exiled Turkish writers, that had Turkey not been involved, the situation could have been completely different in that part of the world. The Christians and the minorities are immigrating in different parts of the world. Some of them, for example, the Armenians, they go to Armenia, they go to Nagorno-Karabakh, they go to Lebanon, Europe, United States, Canada, and Australia. The exile of Christian Armenians from Syria is a tragedy of immense proportions, but it is only one example in the larger tragedy of Christian persecution in the region. Today, all of Syria's Christians face agonizing decisions as individuals and as communities. Should they remain neutral in the civil war or not? Should they try to make common cause with their neighbors? And what will happen to them in the eventuality of a regime change? With such choices, there is a very little to serve as a guide or to guarantee that a given course of action will in any way help their conditions. Above and beyond the existential challenges, the uncertainty that they endure every day is gradually eroding their will to preserve in Syria. Indeed, all the Christian minorities and other minorities in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere find themselves in a desperate situation beyond what they expected or deserved. For example, in Syria, in northern Syria, where certain places is like Tower of Babylon. There are many different minorities, and beside that, there are many different groups, terrorist groups, Islamists, who are running and who are destroying the churches, the homes, the cultural centers. And all this could have been avoided had Turkey not backed them up. And it's continuously backing them up. The Christians in Syria, the Syrian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, as well as other minorities, the Kurds, the Yazidis, have suffered a lot and continue to suffer. Today, of course, they are suffering incredible intolerance so that their continued existence in their homeland hangs in balance. In 2018, according to the Syrians for Truth and Justice, a radical Islamic group seized upon 400 houses and 40 shops owned by Christians in the province of Idlib. Because of difficulties, most of the minorities in Idlib moved to government-held area or abroad to different parts of the world. The Islamic group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the terrorist group of Idlib, are confiscating the assets of the Christians, the Muslims, the Yazidis, the Kurds, and they continue persecuting them. Christians in the province of Idlib, mainly of Greeks and Armenians, had to flee because they were the wealthiest groups in the region. Just recently, about 14 Kurds were abducted by the Turks, or Islamic groups backed by the Turks. And it's non-stop, going on every day. For example, last week, they cut the water in Hasake, where the minorities suffered. The Turks, they cut the water to Hasake. And the whole world knows about it, but nobody is doing anything. And there is one country that could play a very important role, and that's United States of America. But we don't see any leadership. We don't see any group that is really supporting these minorities, whether they are Christians or non-Christians in that region. I thank you very much for your attention. And once more, thank you for the invitation. And I'm ready to answer any questions that you like. Thank you.
Before we go to our next speaker, who's Kino Gabriel, let me just clarify that he represents the Syrian Democratic Forces. Kino, the floor is yours.
Unmute, unmute.
Okay, thank you, David, and good morning, all. I really appreciate this opportunity that you gave me to be able to shed some light over the situation that we are currently having and or previously had for the general Christian community and specifically for the Syriac Assyrians. Basically, I think I will speak, let's say, a little bit about the Christians and the Syriacs in Syria. I think if we can talk about it, I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to speak about it a little bit. We can start their history from thousands of years in this land, which is called Mesopotamia, or the land of the two rivers, or between the two rivers. Which was basically the cradle for civilization, which started with our ancestors, basically. We created, I think, I can say, a lot of new stuff, mainly the language that was globally used by different civilizations and the states back at that time, and during, I think, Christianity, the Syriac identity was created with the merging of the heritage that we had from our ancestors and the ideas and the thoughts that we got from Christianity, which created, I think, basically the Syriac identity that we have now. I'm not going to speak about the history a lot, but going back a little bit to our recent history, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, mainly it was a major event that shaped the presence of the Syriac Christian community and also other Christian communities in the Middle East. We have, I think, we can focus about different policies that were used by the Ottoman Empire against the Christian communities, especially the Syriacs, which eventually denied them their rights to be identified as a group of people or an ethnic group. They denied their civil and political rights, and I think the major event was the ethnic genocide, which eventually led to the killing of approximately 750,000 Syriacs, also approximately 1,500,000 Armenians, and almost or approximately also 300,000 Greek voters. I think that was one of the major events that, as I said, shaped the presence of Syriac community and Syriac people in the whole Middle East, also with other Christian communities. Later, with the establishment, I think, of the Syrian state, the Syriacs took a big role in the creation and the development of the newly born Syrian state after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Back at that time, the Christians in general were almost 25 to 30% of the Syrian population. Also, I want to mention here that except for the Armenians, the majority of the Christian community in Syria can be considered Syriacs, although it got, let's say, it got promoted or got through different policies which led to a big part of this community to change or to be forced to change its ideas or its identity through different policies, mainly Arabization, which was led by the Ba'ath regime in Syria. I think back at that time also, or after the 50s, the Syriac and the Christian community in Syria faced also a lot of hard times. It got through very hard or very oppressive policies, starting from, as I said, Arabization, also the closure of ethnic clubs, mainly sports and youth clubs, the closure of Syriac schools in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Al-Hasaka governorate in general, mainly in Kamishki and Hasaka cities, and also focusing on the, let's say, less developing the areas where the Christian and the Syriac community lives, especially in the east here, which eventually led to the immigration of thousands of the Syriac community, mainly in two waves. The first wave was in 1950, especially after the unification of Syria and Egypt, which mainly created a bad situation for the Syriac Christians. And the second wave was mainly due to the bad economic situation in Syria in general, but mainly also for some political reasons. And that wave happened between 1980 and 1990 mainly. Moving later to the beginning of the Syrian revolution back in 2011, I think it's safe to say that the Syriac Christian community was hopeful that this revolution or this movement would lead to main changes in the way that the current state of Syria is running. But unfortunately, I think with the shift of the Syrian revolution towards military work, they got their suspicions and they got their fears of the outcome of such movement, especially that the major factors of the major players of the opposition group were mainly extremist radical groups, which also attacked the Christian populated areas in Syria in different occasions and different parts of Syria, starting from Damascus to Aleppo to Homs governorate, also in Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor, and almost all over Syria. So I think the bishop also mentioned some of them, and I don't want to repeat them. Later, with the creation of Jabhat al-Nusra and Daesh, they also, part of their work affected not only the affected the Syrian population in general, mainly the Arabs, and in parts of it, the population of the northeast, mainly the Kurds and the Christians, but also in some occasions it was focusing its operations against the Syrian Christian communities, mainly in Sadad, Kraitain, Ma'lula, also in Kabul region, which eventually led to the immigration of parts of those communities to other regions of Syria or abroad. I think it's safe to say that during or at the beginning of the Syrian revolution back in 2011, the Syrian Christians were making up almost 15% or 12 to 15% of the general population of Syria. Currently, I think the estimates or the number estimates of less than 10%, and that is a major drop for the Syriac and Christian community population in general. I think also in the same case, the Syriac people in general found the Turkish intervention, especially their support for factions that are known for their radical extreme mentality, created a situation of fear for the life of for the life of our community, for the future that our community might have in our homeland, and eventually the evidence of these operations or the consequences of these operations, many led by Turkey in different times and in different occasions, prove that they form a risk against the Christian community in Syria in general, and mainly also against the Syrian community. And that is something that we have seen in Idlib, in Afrin, in Tel Abyad, in Ras Al Ain, and different other places. And all of that, I think, created some unstable situation for the Christians in Syria in general.
Now, could you bring your remarks to a close so we can move on to the next panelist?
Yeah, I'm coming with David. Now I think I want to have some conclusion over the results of the recent Turkish intervention against North and East Syria, and previously back in 2018 against Afrin region. Mainly, I think we can say that almost 45 villages and towns at the far northeast of Syria were attacked during the Turkish operation that started on October 9, 2019. The majority of those villages and towns are lying in the 1 to 5 kilometer area of the border, which was mainly the main or part of the main operation areas. In Ras Al Ain, almost or previously had 71 families living within the city. Currently, only 1 to 7 people are living in the city of Ras Al Ain, and they are coming and going back, but the whole situation is very hard and very difficult for them. The properties of the Syrian Christian community in the city got confiscated, got stolen, and there was a big loss, especially in the agricultural area. Almost every land that was belonging to Ras Al Ain area got their corpses stolen and their machinery confiscated.
Kino, I have to ask you to conclude your remarks now, please.
Okay.
If you're ready to conclude, we can move on to our next speaker, who is Abid Shamdeen.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. I think, let's say, I think the whole Turkish support for different groups, especially extremist groups in Syria, led to very bad results against the Syrian Christian community in general, and whether it is northeast Syria or even northwest Syria, where Christian Kurds were living. And comparing this situation for the time that the democratic self-administration of North and East Syria was in control of this land, or this area was is very different and very extreme. So I think this intervention of Turkey created a very bad situation, as I said, for the Syrian Christian communities. And I think there is a need for practical steps from different entities and from mainly the Western governments in order to safeguard the presence of the Christian community in Syria and prevent Turkey from going on with its plans of demographic change, of persecution, which are already seen in everywhere. And I think I would finish it. I think if we can read the latest human rights report from the committee from the Human Rights Committee for Syria, which was delivered to the United Nations, it can, I think, conclude what any area under Turkish control can have. Thank you.
Tom, are we ready to pass the baton to Abid?
By all means, thank you, David.
Thank you, David, for organizing this, and thank you, Tom, for the introduction. I'm honored to join everyone here today. For the sake of time limit, I'll try to be as brief as possible and just covering the recent history and what it means basically to be a Yazidi in that region, but specifically from my experience growing up in Sinjar, Iraq, what it means to be a Yazidi there. So from what I can remember is that when Yazidis were moved to northern Iraq, specifically around Mount Sinjar, from what my father told me at least, is that in the foothill of Mount Sinjar, where Yazidi villages were, they took refuge in the mountain during the Ottoman Empire's invasions of that region and campaigns of violence against Yazidis, and of course Armenians and other groups. And this was one of the reasons that Yazidis located around Mount Sinjar for safety reasons and built their own, if you look today, almost all of Yazidi religious sites, especially in that area, and are inside Mount Sinjar. And the reason being is, you know, they were afraid of building their religious site out in the open. When Saddam's regime took over, and early on during his regime, what he did is force Yazidis to relocate to what's called mujama'at, collectives, that are near Mount Sinjar but not on the foothill of the mountain and on the mountain. The reason was for easy control of the population. And I grew up in one of the collectives there on the north side of Mount Sinjar. And I can tell you, during Saddam's regime, although there was no campaign of genocide against Yazidis, there was a campaign of repression, severe repression in terms of economic opportunity, access to education, clean water, and just basic human services that one needs and can thrive. I remember growing up, going to school in one of those villages, and walking in the mud, in unpaved roads, going to one of the only few schools that existed in our collective of 40,000 people. And life for Yazidis in that region has always been difficult in terms of, like, we didn't have access to a college, a university. There were no institutions in our region. And that put limits on Yazidis in terms of education. Of course, most Yazidis were, for these reasons, farmers and dependent on cattle. But as drought came, those opportunities were also limited. To fast forward to the toppling of Saddam's regime in 2003, we all know from what the bishop mentioned and what Kino said, in terms of the rise of radical Islamist groups, especially in Iraq, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Jihad al-Tawheed, and these groups that came to the scene in Iraq after 2003. And Yazidis became one of the main targets of these groups, specifically Al-Qaeda. One of the biggest explosions in Iraq in that period was by Al-Qaeda targeting Yazidi villages south of Mount Sinjar. Two collectives, hundreds of Yazidis were killed and thousands were injured. And many are still, they don't know anything about those that just were missing. And then Yazidis, like I said, with the lack of institutions in that region, Yazidis had to go to Mosul, for example, Baghdad, and other places to attend college, university, and find jobs. But Yazidis were often and constantly stopped at checkpoints that were done by Al-Qaeda and other groups, and Yazidis were killed for the specific reason of just being Yazidis, no other reason. So that period was a violent period for Yazidis from 2003 to 2014, and Yazidis were targeted based on their religion, based on their identity. And that period witnessed in Iraq, in at least in the north and some places, improvement in economic opportunities, but unfortunately, again, discrimination against Yazidis was present, and Yazidis were not able to manage their own areas in Sinjar and other places. Investment in their areas was very limited and put strains on Yazidis in terms of having economic opportunities and surviving in that region. Also with that, there was a period of dehumanizing Yazidis, and a lot of rhetoric, like what we saw or what we know from what happened against the Jews in Germany, in Europe in the 1930s, in the lead up to the Holocaust, where Yazidis were seen as unbelievers, not people of the book, and people did not eat their food because they were Yazidis, and products from their farms and so forth. And there were a lot of rhetoric, combined with the attacks from Al-Qaeda and other groups. This is one of the reasons that then build up the momentum for ISIS to recruit and get people to join them with that attack in 2014, August 2014, on the Yazidi homeland in Sinjar. And we all know what happened there with ISIS coming, and of course, the security forces and the government abandoning Yazidis. Thousands of Yazidis were killed. Thousands of women and children were taken into captivity, which we still have more than 2,800 women and children missing, mostly in Syria, northeastern Syria, where radical terrorist groups are controlling those areas supported by Turkey and others. It led to the displacement of the entire Yazidi population from Sinjar and other parts of Iraq. 6 years after today, we know that the majority of Yazidis, close to 250,000 Yazidis, are still displaced, living in camps inside their own country, only a few hours away from their homeland. And more than 6 years actually. Now we have about 83 mass graves that contain the remains of Yazidis that were killed during the genocide in 2014. Most of these mass graves have not been exhumed yet to date. The suicide rates among Yazidis, especially in the camps inside Iraq, are on the rise. The exploitation of women and children is on the rise because of their economic status in these camps and lack of opportunities, and they're dependent on handouts from organizations and other groups and people who are affiliated with political parties and they have their own agendas. Those that manage to return to Sinjar are facing many challenges, including one, security, the presence of many militia groups, two, lack of access to services, Although we are working tirelessly to bring a lot of services to these areas, the government is not stepping up their efforts to rebuild what ISIS destroyed in terms of schools and clinics and other basic services and access to hygiene and wash and things like that. But also what's important is that justice has been denied to Yazidis so far, even though there is overwhelming public evidence of what ISIS did against Yazidis. Evidence has been collected by the UN investigative team that is in Iraq now. There are testimonies of thousands of Yazidi genocide survivors and survivors of sexual violence, but we have not seen that materialize in a court of law against ISIS perpetrators. Today, I think the international community also has abandoned their responsibility to protect vulnerable groups like Yazidis. There is a lot of talk about, protecting women and children, vulnerable groups, religious freedom, but in words only, not deeds, to be honest. And this is what we can see. This is the reality on the ground, that Yazidis are suffering from lack of access to basic services, justice, and just recognition of crimes committed against them. But the situation, of course, of Yazidis in Syria was not much different. They were displaced due to ISIS attacks. Thousands were displaced from their homes. But after the announcement that ISIS was defeated, those that returned to their villages in northeastern Syria, with the takeover of the radical Islamist groups supported by Turkey now, Yazidi religious sites have been destroyed. We know for a fact names of villages have been changed, and Yazidis have been kidnapped. In the recent UN report, it was mentioned that a number of Yazidis were kidnapped and interrogated and asked to convert to Islam. So the discrimination and attacks against Yazidis in Syria are similar, but I wanted to just focus on, from what I know, what I'm closest to in Iraq. And of course, everyone talked about attacks against Christians in Iraq and others, so I don't want to repeat that, of course. I can just come to conclusion that, the word tolerance really doesn't exist, in religious groups like Yazidis, Christians, and others are still in danger. And the faith of Yazidis and Christians probably in Iraq will be like the Jews and will have to leave, unfortunately, unless some serious support comes to them from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abid. Nadine,
Yep.
if I may ask for you. Thank you.
Great. Be glad to. Thank you, Tom, and also to David Phillips for this important discussion and for letting me be a part of that. I appreciate it. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, also called USCIRF, is an independent U.S. government agency with the mandate to assess religious freedom conditions abroad and make recommendations to our own government, to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. We are led by 9 commissioners appointed by the President and the Republican and Democratic leaders of the House and Senate, and we have a professional staff of 20. As some of you have noticed, we have taken a special interest in Northeast Syria and the conditions created by the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria and the Syrian Democratic Forces. The one thing missing in discussions I found about Northeast Syria is their governance. It takes more than military operations to permanently defeat ISIS. The Autonomous Administration and the SDF understand this. After liberating an area from ISIS, they would immediately set up governance, not their governance, but self-governance in neighborhoods where, they would choose a man and a woman to be co-chairs, and then they would set up economic co-ops, education committee, healthcare committee, et cetera, and start meeting their needs as a community while promoting religious tolerance, human rights, and women's rights. I wish this approach would have been taken, frankly, in the Nineveh Plains and Sinjar, and how different without having a gap in that kind of governance. I first heard about the Autonomous Administration when I came to USCIRF when I was appointed by President Trump as a commissioner in May of 2018. It's the only place in the Middle East where people can proselytize and legally change their religion. I was able to visit in November of 2019, where I went to the Nineveh Plains as well as to northeast Syria, and I saw the conditions for myself. I met with religious minorities, government officials, as well as visited Tel Tamar, close to the front lines where Turkey was then invading. I went down a few day break from some of the action that was happening, and it was heartbreaking seeing the neighborhoods that Turkey destroyed while entering. I visited a hospital and met with doctors and nurses who wept as they talked about the people they were not able to save the week in days before I arrived. In April, during the release of our USCIRF annual report, we surprised many with the bold recommendation that the US government should exert significant pressure on Turkey to withdraw from Syria. We had full bipartisan support because facts are clear. When Turkey invades and occupies areas in Syria, their troops and Islamist allies commit atrocities against minority communities, against Christians, Yazidis, and others, including killing, rape, kidnapping, torture, forced conversion, arrest, extortion, and the destruction of religious sites. In August, Radwan Mohammed, a Kurdish Christian and a friend, was arrested for apostasy because he had had a Christian funeral for his wife, even though they had converted many years before. It's important to know that the Christian converts' story has really not been told in Afrin in those areas, but now they are starting to be targeted. Afrin was once a beautiful and a free community governed by the autonomous administration, but now they're under Sharia law being administered by Turkey's Islamist allies. The contrast could not be more stark. USCIRF held a congressional hearing on June 10th called Safeguarding Religious Freedom in Northeast Syria. And we documented the remarkable conditions in the autonomous administration of North and East Syria, and also comparing it to the horrific conditions in the areas Turkey invaded and occupied. And of course, the UN report released on Tuesday that Kino and Abid just mentioned confirmed these conditions as well. In fact, panel chair of the commission, Paulo Pinheiro, said that the Turkey-backed Syrian National Army may have committed war crimes of hostage taking, cruel treatment, torture, and rape. And in addition, Genocide Watch has come out with a statement as well, condemning Turkey's actions in these areas and calling them crimes against humanity. The Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army and other Turkish-supported militias have posted videos of themselves committing these atrocities against civilians, and we're all very familiar with the execution of the female Kurdish politician, Havran Khalif. I've seen dozens of profiles myself of former ISIS emirs and fighters that are now part of the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army and stationed in either Serikani or Tel Abyad, cities invaded in October of 2019. They are committing the same atrocities against religious and ethnic minorities that they did under ISIS. The Rojava Information Center, as well as some other news sources, have documented many of these. For instance, one of the ones, just give you an idea of one of the profiles, Khalid al-Akik was imprisoned by the Syrian regime for terror offenses before 2008. He was then freed by the Free Syrian Army in 2013. He joined al-Nusra before moving to ISIS, when he filmed himself committing atrocities and dumping bodies into a mass grave. He came in through Turkey in 2014 in order to join ISIS, and then fled back to Turkey when the SDF pushed them back. He is currently stationed as part of the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army in Tel Abyad. So many profiles are very similar to that one. See, ISIS is just a brand name. Khaled al-Ak has never changed his occupation. He's still governing by violence, and he's using Islam as cover. He's still committing the same atrocities against religious minorities, against Christians, Yazidis, and others. Those working with Turkey in the areas they've occupied in Syria are just another version of ISIS. What many don't know is that Turkey has a troubling history of supporting extremism. The US Army documented that between 2013 and 14, 90% of all foreign fighters had came through Turkey. And Brett McGurk, who previously was the special presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, stated that over 40,000 foreign fighters from 110 countries came through Turkey to fight ISIS, or I'm sorry, to fight for ISIS and join ISIS. And The Guardian even documented that Turkey ran a formal border crossing with ISIS, and they had the manifest that proved the people that came across. Turkish law enforcement has been known to turn a blind eye to jihadists, with courts often releasing them from pending trial or granting them parole, in stark contrast to the harsh treatment for political dissidents. In October 2019, the US showed their lack of trust in Turkey by excluding them from the raid with the SDF on ISIS Emir al-Baghdadi that was near the Turkish border. Turkey has been given a pass because they are a NATO member. The opposite should be true. They should be held to a higher standard because they are a NATO member. The international community can no longer look away while Turkey supports jihadists committing atrocities against Christians, Yazidis, Kurds, and other minority communities. We need to treat Turkey based on its own actions and who President Erdogan says they are, not by who we want them to be. President Donald Trump has stated that religious freedom is the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. With that being the case, the U.S. should take USCIRF's recommendations to pressure Turkey to withdraw from Syria, and also our other recommendations, including expand engagement with the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, give political recognition to them as a legitimate local government, and lift sanctions from all the areas they govern. The U.S. should also demand their inclusion in all activities pursuant to UN Resolution 2254, including meetings in Geneva. As the only successful government in Syria representing a third of the country, they deserve to be a part of the future of Syria. In fact, it is likely the only way to ensure that Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities are able to survive and even thrive in a future Syria. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Nadine. I just want to commend the work of the Commission. Your congressional testimonies and your reports are so compelling, and they're available online. We can also make them available to participants in today's conference if you so request.
That would be wonderful, thank you. And I did post a link for those that are attending live, but uscirf.gov is a good place to go where we have, you can watch the hearings we've had, and you can download some of the documents that document. We had some wonderful testimonies you saw from our hearing that was very compelling and is very troubling.
You provided a lot of critical information. You also associated yourself indirectly with a comment that Vice President Biden made at Harvard in 2014, where he said that Turkey was running the jihadi highway from Sanliurfa to Raqqa. It was providing weapons, logistical support, and money to jihadists who were killing Kurds and Christians and others. So this kind of documentation and evidence is crucial as we build a case for war crimes and accountability. We have a question about the role of Christians in the Syrian Democratic Forces and also the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. Maybe, Kino, you can answer that question, and then Nadine, if you want to weigh in, we'll start with you, Kino.
Okay, thank you, David. So, for the role of the Christians in the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Democratic Administration of North and East Syria, we are in our different groups, political, military, and others. We took part in the formation of the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Democratic Administration of North and East Syria since its beginning back in 2014 and 2015. We are taking for the Democratic Administration. There are several posts for the Christians in each administration. Normally, I think it's not something written, but it is known that each administration should have representatives from the three main components of North and East Syria, which are Kurds, Arabs, and Syriacs, or Christians in general. Also, I think one of the basic points that we want also to focus on is the social contract, which is almost the constitution for the Democratic Administration, which was written by representatives of the three main components of the area here, and mainly represents the ambitions, the ideas, and the rights of all those people, and guarantees the rights of the Christian community in the area. I think it is maybe some more development, but as a basis, it can be used, and it is very good comparing to anything else similar that we have in the Middle East in general. Even in Iraq, the Christian community doesn't have such rights based or guaranteed in the constitution of the social contract. Regarding the Syrian Democratic Forces, the part of it is the Syriac Military Council, along with other forces. We have the Sutoro, which is part of the internal security forces, and they were part of the foundation of the forces, and they participated in every major operation and in the defense of all the areas, and they are currently taking part of the operations to eliminate ISIS sleeper cells. So it is a joint work and almost joint administration and leadership over the administration and the military forces.
Thank you, Kino. Nadine, could you weigh in and add a little bit about the role of Christians in local government?
Sure. So, you know, first of all, I had the opportunity to meet Christian military leaders, like from the Syriac Military Council, as well as Christian political leaders when I was there, and they are well represented. You know, in the Christian communities, they're going to have a lot of Christian leaders. But I've met their vice president of the autonomous administration as a Christian, and several of the other leaders. So they are very represented throughout the government. I think it's really important to understand too, there are other governments in the Middle East, as Kino attributed to, that have much larger Christian populations, and you'll never see a Christian, even in the military, you'll never see a Christian anywhere in a leadership position. So the fact that there is so much representation is actually abnormal compared to the rest of the governments. And so that's one of the things that the autonomous administration, you know, has been the multi-ethnic, multi-religious approach of the whole way the government was built is really impressive. And we've urged the US government to not go back to the way that we often do, like we did in Iraq, where we kind of separate everyone up by ethnicities and religions, because that's not what they've done in autonomous administration. And we don't think that's a healthy thing. We think the multi-religious, multi-ethnic approach of the government is part of what makes it so special.
We're joined by Sinam Mohammed, who is the STF representative in Washington. Sinam, do you want to comment on the affirmative role of Christians in local government? If you do, please unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Thomas Kaplan, and for Nadine and all the panelists here. Amazing and significant panelists. Really, I'm so happy and honored to be with this panel. You know, you mentioned many important points here. We mentioned all of the panelists. They mentioned about the violations for the human rights going on for the Kurds in Afrin, for the Christians, for the Yazidis, and all the other people who is living in the occupied region in north of Syria. But I would like here to say something. Okay, I think Nadine, she mentioned about the administration. The administration is, as I see it, it is the only solution that we can support such administration, such system, which guaranteed the rights of all the religions there, the freedom of religions, as it was in Afrin. And I know what was in Afrin was that time we had many Kurdish, I think about 3,000 Kurdish from Afrin, they be converted to Christianities, and they were very able to practice their religion there without any fear. It is unlikely what was before during the Syrian regime. So this is very important. How could, so I would like here to ask, I mean, just one question. What could we do in order to support such a system in Syria and to be a model for all over Syria? What is the solution to stop all this violation? All of you, they mentioned the violation. They mentioned what happened to the Christian, the Syriac from Turkey, from the other groups, from backed by Turkey, from the ISIS. But let me see here. Okay, we know all these violations, but what is the solution for that? How could we stop it? How could we end such violation for the Christians? Middle East is a cradle for all the religions. How can we see the Middle East, which will be after many years, if it goes like that, it will be no Christian will be there, no Syriac will be there, no Jews. Actually, it happened in Syria and all that would be there. So after that, we will lose this, the diversities in the Middle East, which is only will be the people who are radical people if we stay in this situation. So now it's very important for us to solve the problem, to solve the solution for the Syrian crisis. And in order to do that, the administration of Northeast Syria and the SDC, they are not included in the peace talk of the Syria. And they are excluded from the Constitution Committee, which is very important to say that this constitution of the future of Syria must have the freedom of religions, must guarantee the Christians' rights, the Syriac rights, the Kurds' rights, the Yazidis' rights there, which is really everyone now, even the Yazidis people, they are very afraid after many years will not be seen any Yazidi in the region, which is very dangerous now here. So this is what can I say, the administration, sorry, the Northeast administration, it is the system that, or the model that could be supported and could be protected even from the violations, from the attacks coming from Turkey and the groups backed by Turkey, so that it will be a model for all over Syria. I'm not telling that this model should be the same as it is, but we can talk together. Syrian people can sit together. They can discuss this model. Maybe we can improve it. Maybe we can make better than this model together. But it is a basic model that we could together sit as a Christians, Syria, Kurds, Yazidis, Arabs, Muslims, all together will be at the same table discussing the future of Syria and finding the solution. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much.
So Sinam has raised an important point about the administration in North and East Syria being a model, an affirmative model for women, for minorities, for different religious groups, not only for Syria, but across the Middle East. Vicken, you lamented the lack of US leadership, but recently we saw overwhelming passage by the US Congress of a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide. I want to acknowledge that the chairman of the Armenian Assembly of America, Van Krikorian, and the Assembly's executive director, Brian Ardouni, are here with us on the call. Van, can you comment on the passage of the resolution and its significance?
Sure. Thank you, David, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm sure everybody is wondering how much time I'm going to take and whether it's going to extend it even further. But let me just say that the United States draws its strength in international relations from being a moral voice for democracy and rule of law. United States played a key role in trying to stop genocides, at least of Armenians and others, historically played a prominent role in drafting the Genocide Convention, affirmed the Armenian genocide was part of that history. At the time it was being considered in the 50s, President Reagan acknowledged the Armenian genocide. But just the pure force of revisionism for political reasons and basically denying genocides so that they could recur became critical to successive Turkish governments. And those efforts continued to a point where the United States State Department and then successive administrations were reluctant to use the term. So after, I will say, a lifetime of trying in my own case, in the end of 2019, finally Congress, both the House and Senate passed resolutions acknowledging the Armenian genocide, which also acknowledged the genocides of the Greeks, the Assyrians, and other minorities who were swept up in the same. And we really thank everybody of goodwill who helped us with that all along. And this concept of those, you know, who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it really recurs as we see it over and over again. The question of what should be done is the one that I'm sure has been going through everybody's minds all at the same time. And I want to give you credit, David and Mr. Kaplan. I've never met you before, and the panelists. You know, I think it starts with events like this first to raise public awareness, and then to make the point that Nadine made, in that if we have this, you know, clear information, then it has to start to inform policymakers, and we have to keep talking about it, and it will take a long time, and to the extent anyone can learn from our own experience, you know, I started working on these issues when I was 17, and I'm 60 years old now, but it finally got done. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I will just stop there because I'm quite sure people made plans to get off this call at noon.
Okay, well, we've extended the time of the call. Thank you, Van, for that. Let me just say a couple of words in closing, and then Tom will give you the final word. Van raises a very important point, that if we deny crimes that have been committed in the past, then those crimes are likely to be repeated. When we turn a blind eye to those crimes, we become accomplices. Nadine's already established the link between jihadists and their crimes in Syria and their support from the Turkish government. Let me also add that by turning a blind eye and inviting Turkey's invasion of Syria, that the US government and the Trump administration also becomes an accomplice to those crimes. We had a rich discussion. As an author, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this week I've just published a new book called Frontline Syria, From Revolution to Proxy War. And if anybody's interested, we can make information about that available. We've learned a lot from the panelists. The question that is lingering, what we can do about it, how do we influence members of Congress, this current administration and the next administration to be more proactive in protecting Christians and minorities in Syria and Iraq? What can we do to advance the cause of Chaldean Christians who have suffered terribly? So it's a responsibility for us all to do our utmost to raise awareness, to have our voices heard, to amplify the voices of victims, which is why we're so glad that Abid and Kino were able to join us. So I just want to thank the panelists for a very rich discussion. And I'll give the floor back to Tom Kaplan to say a word of conclusion.
Thank you, David. And thank you to all of our panelists, those who gave us reports, as it were, from the front line of persecution and genocide, all the way through to Nadine with her call to action, and of course, Sinam in her own beautiful way with her passionate, poetic evocation of the necessity to be able to stand up for persecuted minorities. I think it's fair to say that in the broad arc of history, a nation is judged by the way that it treats its minorities. The strong are judged by the way that they treat those who are beholden to them or otherwise dependent on their generosity of spirit. Unfortunately, I think that it is a sad fact that we now have to come to the conclusion that a country with which certainly my generation grew up believing was one of the most stalwart members of the Western Alliance and of NATO, is now going rogue. And unfortunately, The Turkey of Recep Erdogan is engaged on a neo-Ottoman exercise that has to be stopped. Lenin once said, "Thrust with a bayonet. If you encounter mush, proceed. If you encounter steel, withdraw." The only way that we're going to be able to deal with the threat, for it is a threat, and I can tell you from my trips to the Middle East, it is shocking how quickly Turkey is now regarded as an equal threat to much of the Arab world as Iran is. We have to face the fact that we are now dealing with Islamism, political Islamism, as opposed to peaceful Islam, which is bookending the Arab world. You have, of course, the Shia imperialism of Iran, or I should say the imperialism of Iran, which is not necessarily a Shia thing. Iran has generally been a peaceful country for most of its history. But we also have the political Islam of the Brotherhood and its offshoots, which include, whether we like it or not, Hamas and Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra, and we can go on. So what we have here is, unfortunately, the Kurds, the Yazidis, the Syriacs, the Armenians, once again being the canaries in the coal mine versus imperial ambition. And that's what we're dealing with. There is no reason why Turkey should be in northern Syria. There's no reason why Turkey should be in Iraq. There's no reason why Turkey should be in Somalia or Qatar or Libya or provoking conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean. Unfortunately, as Nadine put it so well, Turkey has been conferred immunity because they stay within NATO. Perhaps it is time for us to reconsider whether an ally who buys S-400s from Russia and attacks with such savagery and brutality allies that we had in northern Syria and in Iraq, who lost 11,000 dead, 33,000 wounded in the war against Daesh. Can there have been a greater betrayal than that which befell the Kurds, who after all did what they could to be able to protect minorities and enfranchise women, and not only share our interests in defeating ISIS, but also share our values? No, the reality is we have to reverse that policy, but more than that, we have to go beyond it. We have to accept the fact that Turkey has gone rogue, and the world has to unite and tell them, you now face steel, withdraw. David, you are, as always, a fabulous comrade on the front lines of this struggle. It's a privilege to fly in your airspace, and I'd like to thank you and your program and your team and staff for putting together an excellent group. And I can assure you that Justice for Kurds will do everything that we can to assimilate everything which we've heard in a way that will be of use to our friends, the Kurds, as well as all the minorities with whom they live. Thank you.
Let me just add a word of housekeeping as we close. Tom's focused our attention on Turkey. On the 23rd at 11 a.m., Colombia and Justice for Kurds will convene another Zoom conference specifically focused on Turkey's targeting of Christians within its own borders. We'll have Pastor Brunson and others participating. We invite everybody who's been on this call to join us for the call next week. Meanwhile, debt of gratitude to Justice for Kurds, to my colleagues, Maggie and others at the Institute, to our panelists, and to each of you for joining. So have a good afternoon, everyone, and we look forward to staying in close contact. Have a good day.